Hello, this is Matt Janucki, and you're listening to Season 2 of Inside Men's Mental Health, brought to you by Psych Sessions. Here we explore this thing called masculinity and its impact on men's mental health, relationships, and communities. We'll learn together through conversations with thought leaders, innovators, industry experts, as well as everyday men. Our conversations will help us understand how these individuals became interested in men's mental health and the ways their journeys have made them who they are today. In this episode, I spoke with Dr. Anthony Isacco about men, masculinity, religion, and spirituality. Anthony's program director and professor in the master's program in clinical psychology at St. Mary's University. This conversation touched on the personal as he reflected on his journey from childhood Catholicism to a more deliberate adult faith commitment, which sparked his professional desire to integrate spirituality into clinical work with men. Anthony grounds his work in research, showing that regular religious practice is a health-promoting behavior comparable to exercise, yet men engage less with religion than women. Anthony also emphasized his experiences with young men who he believes are hungering for meaning, dignity, and purpose, as well as a desire to engage in family, meaningful work, and service. Finally, he synthesizes these insights into what he described as an ordered masculinity, or a purposeful manhood grounded in virtue, morality, vocation, and service. Important dimensions of being human that religion is uniquely helpful to support men with. It was great to have Anthony back again, and I think you'll find this episode thought-provoking. Thanks, and enjoy. Anthony, glad to have you back on Inside Men's Mental Health. Last time you were here, we talked about fatherhood and on engaging fathers and your work there, and it was a great conversation, and so glad to talk with you again today.
Matthew, good to be back. Thanks for having me. And I am very excited to continue our conversation into a related but different area, men, religion, and spirituality.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about that's your background as well on men and religion and spirituality and masculinity in there as well. And yeah, I'm excited to learn about your experience there. And I think that people who are listeners may not know a lot about that background. And so I'm excited to bring them into that space with you today. So maybe you can just tell us a little bit about how you got interested in that area, how you came to that topic area.
Yeah, like a lot of things, it's a mix of different, influences and factors, personal and
Sure.
professional. Where would you like me to start?
You start wherever you want.
Okay, well, I'll tell you a little bit about my personal story into it,
Okay.
and then we could always dive into the professional as well
Okay.
too. I was raised in a Catholic family. Religion was more of a thing that we had to do, which was pretty typical of the time in which I was
Yeah.
brought up. And what I mean by that, it was like we had to go to church on Sunday, like
Yeah.
like come heck or high water, like everything stopped Sunday at 10 for us to go to mass. And of course, that practice of religion has its benefits, the discipline of it and the kind of the virtue development. I really appreciate my parents for raising us that way as kind of what we call cradle Catholics. And it really wasn't until like I became like a young adult myself where I think every young adult has to like then make a choice, right? Do I
Sure.
continue with how I was raised or do I go my own way? And we could say that about religion, spirituality,
Yeah.
careers, all kinds of different values and
Sure.
stuff. And so, yeah, I made that choice that not only did I want to continue being Catholic, but I wanted to deepen my involvement and perhaps get like beyond just go to mass on Sunday mentality. And that happened to me whenever I was like a young man. And that choice, quite frankly, is one of the probably the best decision I ever made in my life because
Mm.
it really set me on a trajectory that then had a ripple effect into so many other decisions and choices and things that have happened to me in my life and almost all good. And even when things have gone bad, I've been able to like rely on my faith and my religion to kind of
Yeah.
course correct and maybe buffer against some of the more even devastating things that have happened to me. So in terms of like why am I kind of interested in masculinity and religion and spirituality for other men these days, both on the clinical and research
Yeah.
level and public policy is I think so much of it just kind of goes back to my personal experience and me realizing just how important it was for me, how meaningful it is for me now, how my life would be completely different if I didn't have religion, spirituality in my life, and how I think I'm kind of a quote unquote true believer in the sense of, I've experienced it in my life and have come to believe in it and can think that it can, I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Other men can experience this as well too.
Yeah, I can identify with that as growing up Baptist in Texas, right in the Bible Belt. Like everything stopped on Sundays, and even there, it's not just Sundays, but like there's Sundays, there's Wednesdays. There's this very much this kind of ritual rhythm of faith, and it's very much a part of the rhythm of my family. So can understand that, like as a young man, that was very much something that was tangible in my family, and it was part of me growing up.
Becomes like a
So
way of life,
yeah,
part of the family culture and fabric. And I can imagine like your parents, like friends were Baptists and you
yep.
knew the pastors and it becomes just such a big part of your lifestyle and your community and identity.
Tell me about then. So this is something that was very much, not even was, is very much a part of you that moved into you, like as a adult, like that became your own personal faith as an adult, but also became a professional interest to you as well. So tell me a little bit about how you merged the personal and the professional at some point in time, what that looked like.
Yeah, I think it was a long process. I mean, ultimately, I think this is a long story and it's still being written in a lot
Yeah.
of ways because I'm still trying to figure out the answer to that question after all these years of study. You can't see the rest of my desk right now, but I have like the Bible next to me, the DSM next to me, a handbook on religion and spirituality and well-being,
Mm,
underneath like another book on, spirituality, integrated psychotherapy. So I have tabs and
represents your
everything in
world.
each of those pages of all of those books. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Um, but as I thought about your question, one of the earliest memories in terms of like my career development was in undergrad, and we had to do a like an internship, and then that time it was like get your feet wet,
Yeah.
like do like find anything where will put you in front of other people
Yep.
where
I know
you
that.
can, yeah. So I did mine at my undergrad internship over the summer between my junior and senior year at a local clinic here in Pittsburgh that was a partial program for adolescents.
Okay.
And there's a psychiatrist there on staff who kind of just took a little, interest in me and wanted to do some mentoring and things of that nature. And so we went out to coffee a couple times. And I remember telling him, just at that point in my career, I was like, I don't know what this all means, but I would love to get to a place of like integrating religion, spirituality into my clinical work.
Hmm.
I wasn't as articulate maybe at that point in time, but
Yeah.
that was the basic gist of the conversation. And you know what? I remember him just laughing at me.
Mm,
I mean, like not like pointing and laughing, but like laughing in the sense of like, good luck with that, buddy.
yeah.
Like his perspective as a psychiatrist was very much the medical model and kind of the a non-integrative but mainstream psychological perspective on things, which, looking back, I can understand, some, 20-year-old kid saying basically he wanted to pray with a patient probably sounded a bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that's where, I mean, that conversation represented kind of the starting point for wanting to continue
Mm,
conversations like that and find answers to that question. And I went to Catholic schools for my graduate training, Boston College for my master's, and Loyola University for my PhD. Both of them were fine programs. Don't regret a thing about going to either one of them. But there really wasn't many answers to my questions at those schools, which I found surprising. I was like, oh,
Hmm.
I was going to a Catholic school. I'm Catholic. I want to do integrative
That's
work
the
and
place to go.
research. That,
Yeah.
that I thought that was going to be the place to go. But I found those schools largely represented that same perspective that the psychiatrist,
Mm. Yeah.
represented, with some little twists and turns and things like that. But that was by and large what I experienced. So it was a lot of self-study, I think. And until I think I hit a breakthrough of sorts on my internship year, where I had a supervisor that was non-denominational in every sense of the word. And so he was liberal in like the classic sense of
Hmm.
liberal arts. You could go and talk to him about anything, and
Anything. Yep.
he'd be like, great conversation. Yeah. Like, yeah, let's dive into it. So John Davies, I don't know if you know John from
Oh.
the
Hmm.
University of Oregon.
Hmm.
Great guy, very open-minded. And so he provided just a nice space for me to really indulge, I think, this interest before I graduated, in a very non-judgmental way. He was willing to pass on things for me to read and just at least start to think about my clinical work from this perspective, which was really like that, I think, a big turning point where it's like, okay, there are people in the field that are interested in this and are kind of willing to meet me at some point to help nurture that interest.
Yeah. I love that story in the sense of even though you kind of hit these barriers, that initial barrier in your undergrad of kind of like that's I don't know, kind of silly. That's ridiculous. Why would you do that? You kept at it, you kept thinking about it, and ultimately you found that opportunity, that space to where, you were able to think about integration, which is so interesting because now I think of, just generally, the way we think about people and the integration of identities, and in psychotherapy being an important place to make space for that, right? To think now that sounds, well, yeah, of course we would like make space to integrate like spirituality in there, right? But I can see how, at that time, because you and I are probably pretty similar in age. I'm 46. I can
Yep.
think of like around that time where that would still be like, that's just that we just don't do that. Like we focus on the symptoms, we focus on the treatment. Maybe there are other identities that we could focus on, but that's something that still just felt like, I don't know, that's just not the space for it. So I'm just glad to hear that you kept at it and eventually you got the support to really think hard about it.
Yeah, I think part of some of the stories that we've been telling and the point that you're making really reflects kind of a bit of a disparity out there, which is there's a lot of people, statistically speaking, that identify as religious or spiritual or
Yeah.
think those parts of themselves are really important, except in the mental health field. Mental health professionals typically don't identify as religious, don't affiliate with a major world religion, and then therefore don't identify
Mm,
religion, spirituality as personally important to them. So naturally, that would be like a bias that comes out in
yeah.
training and research and teaching and stuff. And I think basically those stories reflect some of that data that's out
Yeah.
there.
Let's kind of move into the area of thinking through like men and spirituality and putting those things together. Men, masculinity, spirituality. Maybe you can just frame that a bit of men and I know that it's challenging sometimes to separate like spirituality and religion, and like religion can be like a marker to think through people's engagement in spiritual communities, et cetera. And you can help us with that. But like what are some ways to think through like men and their engagement in religious communities, their interest in spirituality, data around that?
Great topic. I love talking about
All
this
right,
stuff
good.
for
Sounds
sure.
great.
Um, so I know a couple pieces of research that I've read that I'm sure you've probably read as well too that like were early influences. One was it was about 1998, 1999 or so, maybe 2000. Will Courtney wrote this article on men, masculinity, and health behaviors.
Yeah.
where just kind of sum up that article, like he looked at 30 different health behaviors and found that like men did poorer than women on
Yeah.
all of those, basically.
Yeah.
So that was kind of data point one, men aren't healthy.
Yep.
And then data point number two was Michael Addis and James Mahalik. They kind of wrote that seminal article in like the early 2000s about
Yep.
men masculine help seeking.
Yep.
And again, like how poor men are at seeking help. It's like the academic equivalent to that comic strip of a man, lost in the woods and the map is right in front of him and he won't look at the map.
Yep.
And his family's like, look, like
Look
there's
there.
yeah, there's a map, there's directions here, and the guy just won't do it. And so as I started to look at those relationships between masculinity and health behaviors, I started to get more into like the academic research around religion and spirituality as well. Within that body of research, and it's become way more developed now, where going to regular mass attendance is good for your health. There's all kinds of studies around that. Praying on a regular basis, so good for your health. We could credit maybe some of the mindfulness research on this, which is like, so robust now. It's just spiritually sitting and breathing and being in silence is good for your health
Mm.
in all these different ways. Looking at those kinds of pieces of research, then it was the other piece. Well, men are poor at health behaviors, poor at help seeking, and they just weren't engaging with religion and spirituality at levels that women were.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wow, we're just kind of collectively, men are really missing out on this area of health and wellness that I knew personally, as I shared in my story, was really
Yeah. Yeah.
important and could be really contributor to flourishing and meaning. But then it made sense for like, the men I was seeing clinically as well too. What's a logical missing piece here? Oh, it's like their like connection to the divine, their connection to a religious and spiritual community and set of practices.
As you talk about that, like their engagement in framing it through health behaviors, I mean, on one hand, that makes a lot of sense to me to think through, engaging with a religious community, prayer, meditation, right? Things like that. That all sounds like a really helpful way to frame these behaviors. Like these are other things you would do to take care of yourself, to increase your health outcomes, etc. Like I don't know, going for a walk, eating better, things like that. I guess I'm wondering, like, what's your experience with that? Like, I could see how in some ways that could be really beneficial to kind of like, it takes maybe a little of the religious baggage away from that. Like, these are health behaviors, they're good for you, right? On the
Mhm.
other hand, I could see how some folks would say that's maybe reductionistic to say like prayer and religious attendance are health behaviors. I'm wondering what your experience has been in like framing these kinds of things that could be good for men, in that way.
Yeah, it can be a trick. It can be tricky. You're absolutely right. Because, engagement with religion, spirituality is more than just me wanting to be like physically healthy or
Yeah.
mentally healthy. I mean, it's definitely is part of that, but it's way more as well too. I did a study early on around 2008, 2009 that kind of looked at the intersections of masculinity and religious behaviors. And there's like kind of two main themes that came about.
Okay.
Um, religion, spirituality can help men like cope with stress and distress. And number two, it can provide a sense of like community and belonging in the face of, isolation and loneliness. Now, that study was probably done 18 years ago, and I think those two things are pretty relevant today
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
men and young men in particular who need help coping with stress and finding community, I tried to frame it from a health behavior perspective, because it fits with like, the profession of psychology,
Yeah.
which I think, I'm writing these things as a psychologist
Yeah.
to psychological audiences. So I had to kind of, use the language of the field, which I think is very important, you know. And at the same time, you know, in clinical work where I'm talking with non-psychologists, you know, lay people who
Mm.
are coming to me for help, I have to be careful not to come across as some like evangelist either and trying to convert them one
Yeah.
way or another. And to kind of reference mindfulness literature here for a second, I think mindfulness paved, I think, some helpful roads to answer this question. Mindfulness comes from Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion. I'm such a dork, Matthew, that I actually looked this up in Psych Info recently. Before 1995, there was like a
Mm.
hundred references to mindfulness in Psych Info database. Since 1996, it's like 44,000
Mm.
references to mindfulness.
Sure.
So to say like, yeah, you know, like you need to be mindful is pretty common sense, like logical advice to give to someone. And I think we're, you know, prayer and mass attendance and things like that don't have 44,000 hits on Psych Info yet, but we're on that path in terms of the empirical support for these things. And so kind of laying it out as, all right, what do we know is good for you? Sleep, exercise, diet, people in your life, finding meaning. Oh, where do you find meaning? You know, religion and spirituality. And how do you connect with your religion and spirituality? You talk to your God, you
Right.
pray, and then you participate in like the norms and behaviors and practices of your religion. So I'm starting to just kind of frame it as like this is basically coming common sense, like scientifically, you know, grounded, good advice that we can put on par with these other health behaviors.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it does sound, like common sense, right? That all of these all of these things that you talked about that take place in a religious spiritual community are good for you, right? Whether it's framed as a health behavior or whether it involves like connection with the divine, right, and other people. But as you talked a little bit about or alluded to a little bit with Mahalik and Addis' work, right, about the barriers to engaging in that, right? Maybe you can talk a little bit about there's so many things that we know are good for us. And in this context, we're thinking about men, right?
Hmm.
That probably lots of guys like they know that I should, talk more to my friends. I mean, I know this. Like I know that I should do better with my friendships. I know that, I should get more exercise. I know that I should utilize my friendships more. I should engage more in my own religious community, right, etc. Yet I struggle with that, right? And I imagine that a lot of guys know that like that religious spaces are these spaces of connection, community, care, yet they also struggle with engagement in those communities. Maybe you can talk a little bit about from that frame of thinking through masculinities and how masculinities can present as challenges to men, like getting those health benefits.
Yeah, I love that question, and lots of things have come to my mind on how
Yeah.
to answer it. Well, I think first and foremost, there's just like a human nature element to how
Yeah.
to answer that question, which is like when you should do something, what like you're like the human part of us is like, like we should eat our vegetables, we should
I don't
wake
want
up
to.
in the morning. Yeah, I
Yeah.
don't want to, you know, and so yeah, should you go like
I
growing
want to eat
up?
hamburgers. Yeah.
I want to eat hamburgers. You know, growing up, I should go to mass on Sunday. There was always a part of me that was like, oh, do I have
Uh,
to?
yep.
So, you know, men probably feel that just that natural, repulse to kind of be like, I don't want to do what I should do. But in terms of like looking at some specifics around masculinity, I think there's some good research and good theory on that. So first of all, you know, taking our ages as examples, mid 40s, you know, I think is a really good jumping off point. You know, we grew up in this generation where there's this weird dichotomy. Like most of the religious leaders were men, but like everybody else and like the pews and things like
Yep.
that and running the parishes and
Yep.
congregations were women.
Women. Hmm.
So just from a pure like a gender socialization theory perspective, men consciously or unconsciously want to be in other spaces with men where that they feel like they have good role models,
Mm,
where they feel like they can be, valued and mentored. And so, like, going to the average parish in like the 1980s and 1990s, they might have entered into a faith community where they looked around and saw basically older women
mm,
hanging
yeah,
out there, and
yeah,
would have been like, this community isn't for me.
yeah,
And they were partially right. There was a lot of disengagement going on in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, where even the most curious guy who was motivated for their health might have walked into a congregation or a parish and walked right back out because they didn't
yeah,
see anybody else like them
yeah,
around. So I think that's definitely one point. And then number two, we can go deeper into the theory and research with, basically, attachment theory is a good frame of reference,
okay,
which, men and everybody kind of views their God through the lens of their primary attachment figures, most commonly their parents, their
yeah,
mom and their dad. And so a lot of research to show that, young men in particular, particularly from Christian backgrounds, learn to view God and relate to God as a harsh, distant disciplinarian,
mm,
primarily because their father was a harsh, distant disciplinarian. And so the breakdown and the connection between young men and religion starts in the family.
mm,
And that's usually where then like the point of intervention can be,
yeah.
is shoring up family of origin relationships with which can then shore up, relationships with God and faith communities and just religion in general.
Thinking of my own experience, my own experience of healing and religious community. A lot of that comes with thinking through what is our view of God, right, and doing some
Hmm.
repair on what that looks like, right. A lot of folks have very negative views of God, right, and trying to like get a better idea, and some of it's even been framed as kind of this reparenting, right, of what is a healthy view of God the Father, God the Son, etc. And so I really like that perspective. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, I mean, all of these world religions, have these beautiful theologies of what and who God is,
Mm,
If only we believed it,
yeah,
like
right.
sincerely believed it and internalized it.
Yeah,
That human element, the world, the worldly influences come in and, can distort these beautiful images and therefore distort, what ultimately God wants in terms of a relationship with us,
yeah,
at least from my Catholic theology, God wants a close, personal, loving, merciful relationship. It's just something that I have to I have to believe and engage
yeah,
in, and go through some of that, my own healing and reparenting in that relationship as well. And I think that is pretty common for a lot of men.
yeah, yeah. Thanks for that. I'm gonna, I don't know how you feel about this, but I'm gonna read you something from your book that you and Jay Wade wrote, your religion, spirituality, masculinity book.
That's right. Jay and I wrote it
Yeah, yeah.
together. Yep. Hmm.
So this is a little long, Anthony. My
Okay.
apologies, but I think the setup is important, and this has to get to uh, this connection between masculinity and what takes place in faith communities, and this is about forgiveness. I think that what whoever wrote this, which one of ever one of you wrote this, but the way y'all describe this is just really poignant and important. And I think there's something salient here about kind of cultural masculinity and then masculinity in faith communities. So humor me while I read this to you, and then we can just chat a little bit about it. In addition, men are more likely to express anger and shame as part of unforgiveness, as well as to seek revenge rather than engage in the process of forgiveness. Shame is an especially powerful emotion experienced by men, which hinders therapeutic progress. Self forgiveness may be particularly difficult for men because of their proneness toward shame, after committing an interpersonal offense. The statistics illustrate the gender differences, but also imply that men are likely to lose out on the benefits of forgiveness and experience compounding psychological distress through anger, shame, and revenge seeking. Take a moment to consider popular culture's representations of offended men. There's a whole genre of movies with revenge as the central theme. Give some examples here: Braveheart, Man on Fire, Death Wish, The Punisher. Indeed, the movies reflect the statistics and perpetuate a stereotype. When a man experiences a transgression, it's a foregone conclusion that he'll seek revenge through a rampage filled path of destruction. There seem to be few, if any, movies that lead male actor that sets out on a journey to forgive their transgressor. In movies and in real life, revenge continues to foster negative outcomes, while forgiveness cultivates resolution and positive outcomes. What I really like about that is the framing of how forgiveness is something that's countercultural in masculinity, and then the challenge to find examples of
Mm-hmm.
that. And you give some examples of these movies that show what masculinity looks like is violent, it's revenge filled, but actually a health behavior is forgiveness, and actually something that also can be very therapeutic as well, but a challenge for men. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the challenge to support men with that, or provide those countercultural examples of forgiveness for men in spiritual communities.
Yeah, it was good to kind of hear that. Jay and I did good there on that section of the
Yeah,
book, for sure. You know, forgiveness is one of those areas that has really blossomed as an area of inquiry, a really serious area of inquiry in psychology, and it's starting to seep more into, I think, the lay discussion that's out there, which I'm really pleased to hear terms of men and masculinity there, yeah, when we wrote that, it was like, oh, you know, who do we point to here as like a positive,
yeah,
as a positive role model? Because it just every example that came to our minds was man gets hurt, man goes on a revenge-seeking mission to destroy
yeah,
everything in its path that hurt him, you know, to the ultimate outcome there. And I guess to be fair to movies, it'd probably be a pretty boring movie if like 5 minutes in there was a forgiveness and resolution.
yeah,
It'd be mini movies instead of full length feature films. But in the book, if I can remember correctly, we did point to John Paul
yeah,
II, who was, you know, the Pope of the Catholic Church up until his death in 2004, I want to say. I mean, he was shot. You know, an assassin, a would-be assassin, was trying to end his life. And one of the first things that he did when he kind of came to and could recover and things like that is that he wanted to meet with that man, and he wanted to meet with him not for revenge, but for to forgive him. I
yeah,
mean, what an unbelievable model of masculinity and manhood John Paul II was. I mean, throughout his life, but in that particular instance, you know, and there's we couldn't get it in the book, I think, because of permissions and things, but there's online, there is just an incredibly cogent image of the Pope with the man in a
mm,
jail cell where they're leaned in very close together. And there, you know, it was a moment in their conversation, but people point to the fact that that moment was actually the Pope hearing that man's confession.
mm, that's powerful.
Yeah, very powerful.
Example is, as you were talking through, that would be a challenging, challenging like storyline to sell, right, of masculinity and forgiveness, and at a popular level. An example that I can think of is, have you seen the show Ted Lasso?
I have not seen it myself, but I know of it and have
Yeah,
seen clips to have the gestalt of it right now.
yeah, yeah. There's a storyline in that where the there's Ted Lasso, the coach, and then he has an assistant coach, and there's another assistant coach that really injures them. He leaves the team and he does some things that are very injurious to them, that make them very upset and angry, and hurts the relationship very much when this one assistant coach leaves. A little bit later on in the show, there's some potential opportunity for forgiveness, but this one coach just really angry about it, and then he's just doesn't want to do it. And the coach Ted Lasso reminds him of some challenges that he had in the past and that he had been forgiven. And there's this very powerful moment where these two people come together, these two assistant coaches, the one that has really hurt them, and then the one that's very angry. And there's this moment of forgiveness between the two of them.
Mm,
and and I every time I think about it, when I've watched it, it makes me tear up, and it just shows this, I
mm,
think, powerful representation of these two men, right?
mhm,
One who desperately wants to be forgiven, the other one who every impulse is to seek revenge, yet he provides forgiveness. And it's a beautiful representation of what that can be. And so like to it's helpful to think of what those are out there, what those models of forgiveness can be. And I think you're right. I think we've come a ways, right, where it's just like we hear more about forgiveness and the benefits that it can provide for us, even not just as a spiritual discipline, right, but even just as something that is a health behavior, right, that is something
mhm.
that can be beneficial for us.
I gave a marriage workshop over the weekend to engage couples, and
Mm,
that was, even in that context, I said, one of the things that you have to get used to saying to each other is, "I'm sorry."
hmm.
That's that's just the reality of married life. There will be transgressions. You can make those transgressions a lot worse,
Yeah.
without an apology or without seeking forgiveness. One of the critiques I've heard, which I think can be valid, of like this intersection of masculinity and religion, spirituality, is that some strands of religion or movements of religion can foster like a hyper masculinity, and maybe like almost a different form of aggression in
Mm,
men, that's not really helpful. And I think I've seen that out there, and I can't discount that or say no, that doesn't happen. But I think, some of the theologies that I've been reading about and have learned myself helps to make this distinction between, aggressiveness that can be oppressive, or kind of like further hurt, a community, towards, a masculinity or a manhood that is ultimately rooted in active service. And there's, if you read the Bible, God calls men into action all the time. Moses, lead my people out of Egypt. Noah, build an ark. Apostles, go fish over there, and then
sure.
go build a church. But all of those actions were things that God told man to do, and told man to do in service of other people. I think that's some important criteria here for us to keep in mind in terms of what religion and spirituality is all ultimately telling men to do nowadays. It is to forgive, because forgiveness is in the service of other people. It is to lead, but only leading in terms of service to other people. So that altruistic quality, I think, is kind of a necessary and imperative criteria, I think, in ultimately judging kind of this intersection of religion and masculinity.
That's helpful to hear you talk about, because I think that is a challenge to think through. That is there are complicated conversations going on.
Hmm.
I mean, everywhere around gender, and that includes in religious spaces of what does it look like for a healthy masculinity in a religious community, right, versus something that is overly oppressive or is oppressive, right? Sorry. And hearing you talk through those criteria, that could be really helpful for men and communities to have in mind.
Yeah, I've increasingly found that helpful in my thought process, and I having people kind of, bring up some different points of view and some different examples that are not very flattering and maybe not
Hmm.
along the lines of,
Hmm.
that as tight of a connection between health and well-being and
Yeah,
masculinity and religion as we'd want them to be, or
right.
as we've been talking about. I think those conversations help to then go back to the drawing board and say, all right, what's going on here, and how do we kind of course correct?
Well, let me ask you about young men and, bringing young men into religious spaces and kind of what the, for lack of better words, I've got a 14-year-old daughter, and so I kind of get the, I pick up a little of the lingo that's going on with 14-year-olds. So she was talking about the vibe. What's the vibe? And so a little bit of the vibe with like young men out there and religious spaces. And I get a little bit of a sense from you. So I'm gonna read you this quote from you. Again, another Anthony Isacco quote. So you write here, so you said, my observation is that the world needs more young men, fully alive, who are living with the deep realization of their ontological dignity and the added dignity of right moral actions and healthy existential dignity that provides meaning and purpose to their lives. And you wrote this after engaging with a bunch of young men, right? And so
Mhm.
tell me a little bit of kind of what you're getting a little bit of a sense of young men's desire to engage in religious spiritual communities, kind of what they're seeking there. I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I work a lot with young men, both as a professor and an instructor, at St. Mary's, and I love teaching young men. I work with young men clinically, particularly young men who are kind of discerning their vocation in life and,
Hmm.
and trying to figure out what God wants them to do. That quote came after I was at a large young person conference in Columbus, Ohio called Seek. There's about 16,000 people that converged upon Columbus for
Okay.
a week, for about 4 or 5 days. And, I was given a talk specifically geared towards young men. The focus of my talk was on their dignity. And I don't know how many young men came up to me after that talk and said, "Boy, that's a very unique talk that we've heard. We've heard lots of talks geared towards us as young men, and this was the first one that spoke to our dignity."
Mm.
So I felt like I kind of struck a nerve there for sure. And through talking with them about the talk, what they hear a lot of is, don't do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
You're problematic in this way, you're problematic in that way. You need to look at yourself through this lens or that lens. And it can become, on a range from like confusing to like degrading to just like completely incongruent with who they are
Mm.
and who they want
Yeah.
to be. And so I've really over the last few years have found some traction with getting back to just like the fundamentals in a lot of ways. And it came actually through a clinical experience, if you don't mind if I share it with
No,
you.
that's fine.
I was working with a young man who was very confused about lots of different things in his life, his sexuality, his gender, his college major, his
Yeah.
relationship with his parents. And we had been doing some pretty heavy lifting for a couple years around all of these topics and had made some gains and had maybe regressed a little bit in some areas. And we got to a place where we both were like just feeling stuck.
Yeah.
And we both acknowledged it to each other. We're like, we're kind of feeling stuck, aren't we? And, I don't know where it came from. I hadn't been planning it or anything like that. And I said, I just want to tell you that we are stuck right now, and that doesn't change the fact that you're just, a wonderful, beloved son of God. Never said those words before in a session, didn't plan to, or anything. It just kind of came out, and the young man just started bawling his eyes out.
Mm. Yeah.
And when he kind of came to and composed himself, he said, I've really forgotten about that.
Mm.
And that is my identity. And that grounded, I think, him, and it grounded us in our work to such an extent. It really sent us on a trajectory of growth from there. And I've used that example to kind of just try to remind other young men that's who they are. Like this, in this age of identity exploration and trying to figure out who we are and who you are, you are a beloved son of God. You are a creation of God, and you have this inherent dignity and worth and goodness. I mean, it's a beautiful, I mean, it's a teaching, but it's fundamental to psychological identity too. And young, what I've have found is that young men need reminded of that, and then whenever they do, like light bulbs go off and their
Yeah,
kind of hearts open up too.
that's beautiful. And thank you for that story. It makes me think of yeah, there's just so many, it seems like, so many guys that, have struggled hearing, things around toxic masculinity, men are toxic, all the problems with men.
Hmm.
And so hearing something like that of your value, right? And of course, embedding that in your value in the divine, right? And whose image you're made in, and who loves you. I mean, it's beautiful. And I love what your quote that I read too, of just the grounding masculinity, or what these men can aspire to based in dignity and purpose and being, right? That grounds their masculinity in something kind of in this bigger purpose, right? That kind of
Hmm.
brings them into something bigger and higher and exciting, right? And I kind of getting a sense that in your interaction with these guys that they seemed interested in that, or they seem like they want that. They want that to engage in something that's bigger. That's they want meaning. They want value. Right? Am I getting that right? They're kind of looking for it.
100%. I mean, the thirst and the yearning for all of that is there. There seems to be kind of an absence of people that are willing to meet young men where they're at and provide the water, so to speak,
Yeah.
for them to drink in those areas. But the thirst and the yearning is there 100%. After that talk, I had guys coming up to me and saying, like, I want to get married. Like I want like I want a family. I want to be a father.
Mm,
Or yeah, I want to help people, and I want to find a meaningful career and job and vocation. And I just heard that over and over again. I think it really taps into yeah, that deep desire. And I think, guys need that permission to move forward with their strengths in that identity, rooted in their identity, and in a healthy, which I think ultimately fuels like a healthy masculinity and ordered sense of manhood for today's young men. Because you're right. I'll go to talks and conferences and I'll say, all right, free association. I say masculinity, you say, and they all say toxic.
yeah.
So we have a generation of young men that have been taught that masculinity is only toxic, and that's just not the truth.
So you just said something I thought was interesting, and I wouldn't mind if you say just a touch more about it. You said ordered sense of masculinity. Can you say a little bit more about that? What that means?
Yeah, ordered manhood, ordered masculinity to me means it has a purpose and has a direction, has like structure to it. And I think some things that psychology is not so good at, that this is why I think religion and spirituality can be so helpful in this
Mm,
regard, and why I take this integrated perspective is that there is right and wrong, and there is morals. And
yeah.
so living to a moral code is ultimately good. Developing virtue is also healthy and good as well too. Morals and virtue, for example, aren't very popular terms in psychology these days. Um, I edited a 600-page book on fatherhood,
Hmm.
and before I published it, I did a word search on moral, religion, spirituality. There wasn't one hit until I wrote the chapter on religion, spirituality, and fatherhood. Um, so, you know, we need to bring these things back in
Mm,
to how we think of the human person. And you know, helping men think of not just find a job for money, but think of a vocation, which gives them both spiritual and professional fulfillment in a sense of meaning. And what they're doing is not just for themselves, but for other people as well too. So that's a bit of what I mean by ordered. It has a more embedded sense of purpose, a more embedded sense of meaning. It brings back in virtue, development, and living by a moral code, which is then rooted in that belief in God as the Father, and us being sons of God as well, and that's our core part of identity.
yeah, that's really interesting. I'm really gonna think a lot about that. I like that. I think what it's making me reflect on is just in this time where certainly we're concerned about young men in particular as the script has changed for men, right? Where they're thinking of like my father's generation, my grandfather's generation, there was more of this kind of script that was more clear that here's what guys do, here's what they don't do, and like that script has changed, and there's a lot of good things about that script changing, that there's more flexibility and there's less patriarchy, et cetera. But at the same time, the challenge is that there's less of a script, right? For men to know like what do you do, what you don't, what do you not do, what does that look like over time. And so some of what I'm hearing you saying is that this ordered masculinity kind of provides like scripting and scaffolding to what masculinity can look like, that it includes like these virtues, and it includes morals, and it includes like what it looks like to care for yourself and care for your community, etc. And so it seems to kind of provide some, yeah, like some scripting and scaffolding. I'm not sure what your preferred metaphor would be, but I that seems like it could be really helpful for young men.
Yeah, my thought goes to this recent data that's been kind of making all kinds of headlines. It came out of like the Pew Research Center and some
Yeah.
others about like this new wave of religiosity and like younger generations. And there was a panel discussion in New York maybe a month or two ago to talk about the data and some of the
Yeah.
people involved in the efforts. And there was a New York Times columnist. I want to say her name is Lauren Jackson, but don't
Okay.
quote me completely on that.
Okay.
Um, where, she said, we all looked for alternatives to religion. We tried. We tried everything to find an alternative to religion. And we're basically what this data is telling her, which I think I would agree with, is that, we just haven't found a viable
Mm,
alternative to religion in terms of giving people a go-to place to have that structure of support, that built-in community, the lessons on how to live life and how to live a good life and
hmm.
how to live a life of meaning. And so, yeah, for young men these days, like I said, the thirst is there, the yearning is there. They've looked everywhere else,
Yeah. Yeah.
and now kind of getting back to the source of all that can be good in their life, I think is really encouraging.
Yeah, that is really encouraging. Yeah, I'll have to make sure I look for that or look at that. That's great. I think that's a great place to kind of bring it home. Anything else that you'd want to add in to a conversation? I want to be respectful of your time. Anything else like to direct people to, or anything else that you might want to clarify that we've talked about today for folks?
No, I really enjoyed the conversation. Hopefully that came out in our discussion here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you about this. As I said at the beginning, I could talk about this all day, every day, because I think it's that interesting and that important. So, really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm glad you're shining a spotlight on this.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks to you for mentioning it and sending me your book, and it's a salient part of the conversation with men generally, whether it's around the how this can be healthy for men across the lifespan, or whether it's around young men. The
Mhm.
it's a significant part of the conversation of how they want to live their lives, find meaning, and so yeah, I'm glad we can shine a light on it.
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome.
Okay,
Well, keep up the good work, Matthew. It was
that
great
sounds
talking
good.
with you. All
You as well. Take care. Bye.
right, bye-bye.